Welcome everyone to CTO Wisdom. Today with us, we have Freedom. Freedom, give us your elevator pitch.
All right. Elevator pitch isn't my strongest suit, but I'm a maker. I'm a guy who spends his time making things, whether that's at home in my garage or whether that's here at my desk at work. Making is really my passion. The great thing about technology is it gives us the ability to iterate quickly and see the results of what we make a lot quicker.
Awesome. So let's start at the beginning of your journey. What got you into technology? What was the spark that says, oh yeah, I like this. I want a part of this. Tell me about your early stages of coding, what you coded in.
Yeah. So it was completely by accident. And I'll tell you, when I started, I wouldn't have thought I was doing anything in technology. I was maybe 5 years old, somewhere around there. My mom came home after, hanging out with friends. She came home with a computer that she won, I think at like a bar trivia night thing or whatever. And it was this Panasonic JR200U. It's a 64K computer that you hook up to your television set. And then now you've got a computer that you can do what with? Well, it turns out not much, because that's, computers in those days gave you a blinking cursor and you didn't know what to do. But it did come with a little book that had games in it. And by games, it was really little basic listings that if you entered them in, you could then play the game when you ran it, as long as you entered it in and didn't have any mistakes or errors. And so I started there. I started like taking those programs from that book of games, entering them in. And by the way, I would get maybe an hour. It was like my allotted television and computer time. So I had to go as quickly as I could to enter in the game and then get it to run. And then I might get maybe 5 minutes to play it before it was time to go to bed. So I was spending way more of my time keying in games on these like rubberized keyboard keys. They're terrible. And after doing that for a while, I got to where I could do it pretty quickly. And I found a way that I could save my games. My grandpa loaned me a cassette tape recorder. I could save the game, so I didn't have to enter them in again every time. And then after I had that, I was like, oh, I can change the game. Like if I change this value, my guy will run much faster and the game becomes much easier. Or if I change this value. And one of the fun things was I discovered I had color commands available to me. The television I was using was black and white, but I would still write color into the games because I thought, I could imagine it. It'd be fun. So fast forwarding from there, every time I got access to a computer in my life, which wasn't consistent throughout my childhood, but whenever I did, the first thing I would do is look for a way that I could write programs for it. I didn't know that's what I was doing. I was just looking for where's the thing I can type in some instructions and then it can do a thing. What that ended up looking like was BASIC. It turned out was practically everywhere in the early years. It was very easy to find BASIC on machines. I had a pirated copy of Visual Basic for Windows 3.11 that I used for a little bit, Visual Basic 1. And I remember the first time I got access to a Mac, I found HyperCard, which had a really cool like visual programming paradigm that I was really psyched about. Never thought of it as programming. And it wasn't until the later years in high school where I realized, oh, people will pay me money to do this. There was somebody who asked me, I can't remember, this was in the late 90s. They said, hey, do you know how to make a website? And I had never made one, but I was like, I'm sure I could figure that out. Of course, why not? And so I said yes. And he said, how much would you charge me to make a website? And I came up with what I thought was a reasonable price. And I said $300, which was an insanely low price at the time. But so he gave me $300 and away I went, and I built my first website. And from there, it was just continuously finding these opportunities where people would pay me money to build software for them. Meanwhile, I was pursuing a day job that had nothing to do with technology. I thought I was going to be an accountant. I ended up at one point I was a branch manager for a bank, but I was spending all of my evenings writing code for people for money. And ultimately, the thing that finally got me into doing this as I would say a full-time professional was the bank I was at. They had a policy where even if you were unqualified, which I was, they would interview you if you were an internal candidate for a job. And they had a software engineer position that opened up that wasn't too far from where I lived. I said, well, they've got to interview me. Let's just see what happens. I applied and did well enough that they gave me the job. And that's when I moved from branch manager at a bank to full-time software engineer. And the rest has kind of been history.
Awesome. Thank you for that story. I share that childhood with you, like writing out basic programs. Sometimes I used a Synclex 70 ZX81, which only had 1K, and you put a RAM pack on it, it had 17K, but the RAM pack would fall off if you typed too hard on the keys. It was just like, you get quite productive, as you say, unintended from your parents limiting your time, but like, I've got to do it fast. I've got to play ping pong or whatever game it is. So awesome. So you're now an individual contributor. You're working for a bank. Tell us a little bit about that part of your career. What were the things that you enjoyed about engineering? Was there a particular area that you liked, i.e. back end, front end, or data, or whatever else? So tell us a little bit about your individual contributor days.
Yeah, so that transition from basically doing contract work on the side to working, professionally at a bank was a really interesting one. I had done everything from, writing in C and assembler to building stuff in PHP. And then I had actually found Ruby and Ruby on Rails. And that became like my go-to stack for everything. And then I got this official job at the bank. And one of the first things they said to me is like, oh, no, like, this is a bank. We do serious programming here. We do it in C# and .NET. That Ruby stuff is for amateurs. And I was a bit disappointed because I was really enjoying it. But I was also thrilled by the challenge to try something new and to add a new technology to my toolbox. It's funny you mentioned the front end or back end, but in those days, I don't think we thought about software engineering in those terms, right? Because today practically everything is some form of a web app. There's some browser component that's the front end, and then there's the stuff that's on the server. But in those days, you really had, your client application might be software that was deployed and installed on the computer. And I don't think we really called that the front end. We called it client, I guess. And then there was the stuff that was running on the server and the mainframe. I don't think I had at any point in time a favorite in that space. What I really loved was digging into the problem that we were trying to solve and really understanding it. And then taking what I had learned really from my Ruby days and imagining how can I best express in code a solution to that problem. And I really thought about the expressiveness of the solution as what I was trying to achieve. And so early days, a lot of my time went into that, and some of the time was wasted. I definitely wasted some of the bank's money building an ORM solution for Access, Microsoft Access, in C#.NET. Nobody needed that. That was but it was all in service of me being able to really effectively express solutions to problems in language that felt both natural to me and to somebody else who was reading the code. As time went on, though, I started to realize that I was not feeling particularly fulfilled with just building out the stuff. I felt way better about the things that I built that people used and gave me feedback on. I can't remember his name, but there was a tool I built for a gentleman in our legal department at the bank. And he reached out to me right after I had delivered that tool to him. It was for some sort of like document sharing tool. And he was just so thrilled to have this thing in his hands that he'd never had. And I was like, oh, that made every painful part of building that thing so worth it and made me want to get back in and do that again. And that was really the first spark for me where I realized like, oh, I'm not doing this for the thrill of making it. I'm doing this for the thrill of a person somewhere in the world saying, thanks to what he did, now my life is in some small way a little bit better, or now I'm enjoying some part of my job a little bit better. That became the catalyst for me to start thinking of like my work in a totally different way.
It is It's amazing that feedback loop, how important it is like, if I spend time working, and it doesn't just apply to software engineers and developers, if I'm doing something and someone else actually feels it and I get to hear that, that's probably one of the strongest motivators. I feel like, particularly in your early stages and early stages of a company where every feature seems to make a big difference to people.
That's right.
So tell us about your entry into kind of management in the space of technology.
So as my career progressed, I moved on from the bank after moving to a new city. I moved to Boston. I was in New Jersey when I started, and moved to Boston after a bank acquisition happened, and I was trying to keep my job. And shortly after that, found that Boston is a city with lots of startup companies doing cool things that were looking for engineers. Very different than my time in New Jersey. So one of these companies that I worked with and went to work for was building this really cool video platform. But times were getting tight, and money was getting short, and the team was reducing. We actually completely went out of business and shut down, and had just enough capital to kind of start a new thing up with just a few people. And when we restarted that thing, the man who was the chief product officer at the company that was shutting down and became the chief product officer at the Phoenix company. I don't know what we call that. The company that spun out of the ashes of that thing. He came to me and he said, "Look, like, you're a great software engineer, and you are able to produce some high quality stuff, but you're going to be more valuable to us leading the team than being the primary software engineer for everything that we do." And that was something I wasn't really, I was only partially interested in that. But I did have some inkling that it would be valuable to take on some leadership roles for a couple of reasons. Number one, as an engineer, especially an engineer early in your career, one of the things that people find out who are experiencing that is it's very difficult to get people to jump in on an idea that you have, right? And as an engineer early in your career, you've got this big vision and you just want everyone to jump in, and you can't, right? You've got to figure out how to get people to work along with you. And I thought, well, maybe if I'm the boss, I can just make everyone do what I want. Well, that's not, by the way, not true. Anyone who's listening to this, you do not automatically get a free pass to get everyone to do what you want just because you're their manager. They always have another option, which is, go somewhere else. So, but there was that. And then there was this other fear that I had, which was, I remembered from early at that company that had gone out of business. We had a pretty good sized engineering team at the time. I think we were 30, 40 engineers. And we had interviewed a person for that team who I quite liked, and the way we did interviews, everyone got to give their vote, and I'd given him a thumbs up. I was like, I really like this guy. He has some cool experience in the games industry and some other stuff that I thought was really interesting and useful. And then I watched all of my peers and colleagues saying like, yeah, he's really good, but I'm not sure he is a good fit for our culture. And I realized at that moment what that meant. It didn't take me very long to say like, oh, see, this guy was 43 or 44, and we were all a bunch of 20 somethings. And what I realized my peers were saying was, we don't think that we want to work with a guy who's twice our age. And that was a heartbreaking realization that this is an industry that is prone to some ageism as well as other biases that I've experienced in my career. And I remember when that management opportunity came up, when our chief product officer was telling me about this, that came to mind. I was like, well, there's a chance, I'll certainly be that age one day. And maybe if I'm a manager, it means I'll still be able to work. Like, well, I don't want to be able to not find work because of our ageist industry. And so that was a part of that thinking as well. So there wasn't any master plan to it, but those two things sort of coalesced, and as well as the opportunity. And I took on the role and started my journey down management. I read a lot of books. They were all terrible. So I won't be naming any of those, but there were a bunch of books on the topic. And then I just started learning as I went, taking off into that new chapter of leadership.
Awesome. Thank you for that. When you think back of your early management career before you kind of got to multiple teams or beyond that, what would you say were the most important lessons that you learned that you now try to embody in your management as your kind of in your team as the CTO?
Yeah, there are two things that an early manager needs to make sure that they're doing. Number one is you have got to be a champion for your team. And that does not mean you're a protector. You're not like, you hear people sometimes saying, oh, my job is to be an umbrella so none of the crap hits my team or whatever. That's not what that means, right? A champion for your team lets your team be exposed to the world that they are living and operating in and influencing, but you give your team a voice. Because if the team catches all of whatever the umbrella is supposed to be protecting them from, but there's nobody standing up to say, well, here's why this is an issue for our team. Here's what's blocking us from being able to achieve our goal based on what you're doing. Then that's just going to keep falling. And if you're just acting as an umbrella, then your team doesn't get to develop and maybe doesn't get to understand the external constraints or the external business conditions that are causing the stuff to be falling down, right? Very well could be a case where your company's going to run out of money next month. If in the case of a startup, don't protect your team from that. They're going to be impacted as much as you. Let them be a part of it, and then let them figure out, how do we bring our company out of this, or how do we participate and bring our company out of this, and be that voice. The other thing that you've got to do as an early leader, don't instantly step aside and manage. People are going to follow you if you lead the way by doing the things that you're asking them to do. So it's true you won't be able to spend nearly as much of your time, for example, writing code or doing system design as you were doing before you became a manager, but you still need to do some of those things, and especially those things that nobody else wants to do, right? They're the fun parts that every engineer wants to be in charge of, and then there's the parts where, like, I don't want to be the guy that sets up the test framework. That sounds awful. Do that. Go lead the way and show them that you're not asking your team to do something you're not willing to do yourself. So that for an early manager, if you can do those two things, you'll find a lot of success.
Thank you, Freedom. Okay, so stepping up into the next stage of like when you started like leading multiple teams, can you tell us about that part of your journey?
Yeah, that came at a later startup. So I was working at a company that was headquartered in California. They'd acquired a company that was based in Boston, and I was originally brought on board to lead the Boston team, and then very quickly was granted leadership rights across the entirety of the engineering spectrum there. And the real challenge is balancing out the expectations that you have as a leader for various teams. So in the same way that individual contributors themselves all have different needs and are going to struggle with different things at different times, teams themselves embody this as well. So you'll find that you'll have a team that's extremely high performing and is getting so much exciting stuff done. And by naturally, sort of the law of technology gravity is going to draw you there to that team that's high performing. And you may have another team which is really struggling to figure itself out and to achieve the goals that are there. You got to spend some time debugging that group. Like, there's going to be a problem that group is encountering that they aren't able to get out of their way themselves. So you got to make sure you're making time for the variances that each team is going to be experiencing and supporting them in different ways. Sometimes that means organization changes. I think that's one of the hardest things to do. The first time you've got to make an organization change, and that comes in a couple of different ways. One of those ways might be, putting a different person on a different team. And by the way, here's a big trap for any manager who's in this place where you've just started taking on multiple teams. You're going to find somebody on a team who's underperforming, and you think, well, maybe it's because of the team they're on. And so you move them to another team that is a high performing team, and you put a person who's been underperforming on that team, hoping they'll somehow absorb that high performing mentality and get better. That often isn't the case. It's very unlikely that a person who's underperforming on one team is going to suddenly become a high performer on another team. It can happen, of course, not out of the question. But in most cases, what you're doing is you're taking a problem and you're sort of spreading it around, right? You're taking a person who's just not really the right fit for what you're trying to do. And now you're hindering another team with that same problem. And that can go on for quite some time. So making that first call to say, this person isn't a right fit for our business, for what we're trying to achieve, that is a tough one. But it's going to be something that a nut you'll have to ultimately crack. And sadly, as I tell people, it's not something that you can ever say you're doing it well. You can't do that. There's no good way to do that, but there's a right way to do that. When you find that person who isn't fitting, make sure, you have the conversation with them quickly that it's not working out. And then you treat them with a tremendous amount of dignity and allow them to retain that dignity. And because the fact that they aren't working with your organization doesn't mean that they don't have value. It just isn't where you're at. Sometimes it's just organizing your teams in a way that the team can actually be more self-sufficient too. By the way, that's the other thing. Something that I find frequently when I've worked with companies, both those that I've joined and those that I've consulted with, is they'll have one team that's doing, say, the front end and the other team that's doing the back end. And then maybe in some cases they'll have some other team that's QA. And there's this ping pong game that's just getting played where, only the team that has the ball on their side of the net is able to really move forward. And the other team is always waiting. You're far more effective if you can combine some of those roles on a team. A team that's made up of everything that it needs to get something done is going to be more efficient. So that's an organizational strategy that you'll discover. So these are those things that I started to discover over time. By the way, not by myself. You don't discover this in a vacuum. Maybe eventually you will. This is the point in your career where finding a mentor is absolutely essential. And I was lucky enough to have two great mentors at this point in my career, and I was able to tell them the challenges I was having and hear their ideas, and some of their ideas were very helpful. And they were also comfortable giving me candid feedback about the things I was bad at so that I could make sure I was either avoiding those things or finding ways to get better at them.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that you call out the difference between individuals and teams, because a lot of our society rewards individuals in different ways it does to our teams. And we're much better at rewarding individuals like pay bumps than we are teams.
That's right.
I still think there's a journey for us to kind of like travel and get really good at team performance. But you really see it in sports games when you have those individual talented players who just don't play a good game together.
Right.
And engineering and many other team sports or activities are no different. Okay, so when was the first time you managed another manager? How was that?
It was during that same period where I was managing multiple teams. Each of those teams had a manager. And, the interesting thing was the expectations of every manager has different expectations from their leader, just like every person who's listening now, right? You've got a set of expectations that you have for how your leader is going to support you. And you're going to have your own motivations. Maybe you're trying to achieve a career objective. Maybe you're trying to really just see something exist in the world, and you're using your manager role to help make sure that does happen. When you are managing managers, recognizing, discovering, and literally writing down and keeping track of those factors is going to be the most important thing in making them successful. I knew right out of the gate that I was going to be successful if they were. Like there was no question in my mind that was the number one thing I had to do. And as long as I believed they were capable of being successful, then I knew my job was to clear the path for them to achieve their own objectives. That's not to say it isn't without friction, though, right? So as a leader of leaders, you're responsible now for a department. And I like to think of a department that you're leading as a small business within a larger business. But that business has money that it's spending, even if it's just on humans and software that you're using. And it has an objective it's trying to achieve. And your job as a manager of a department is to spend the resources and achieve the objective. That's ultimately what you've got to do. And the way that you achieve the objective is something that, as a leader of leaders, you've got to either set that methodology or set those mechanisms in place, or just blindly trust that the managers that are working for you are going to set those mechanisms in place and those are all going to work. I've found it's much easier to lead with context in this case. So instead of specifically spelling out every detail, for example, everyone is going to do Scrum, that kind of a thing is largely going to mean that any failures that happen because of what you've set are going to be placed squarely at your feet. Well, you said we have to do Scrum. That means I can't ship this for 2 weeks because we're on a 2-week cycle. It's something along those lines. Instead, lead by context, which is to say, here is what I'm thinking. Here's what I feel like success looks like for our group. Here's the way that I have approached this in the past, and I would like to support you in achieving the outcome. And then give them all of that context. You'll find that your best managers are going to hear that and understand and probably do what you were hoping they would do anyway. And those who go in a different direction with more context can be nudged back in the right direction.
Awesome. A good example of not micromanaging.
Yeah, I don't think I mean, we all know this, right? Intuitively, we know that any creative pursuit is going to be hindered by a micromanager. And software development is as creative a pursuit as it gets, as far as I'm concerned. So micromanaging in this case, not only is it a waste of your time as a leader and an exercise in frustration, you're going to get a much worse outcome just consistently.
That's awesome. I think the kind of addition I would add is also looking at what your feedback loops are, because as a manager, your feedback loops are very much about, you see the individuals, you see what they produce. Whereas a manager, when you're managing managers, you've got to figure out how you want to do observability for that side so that you don't micromanage and you agree, how do we do this? And giving space to success. And then when things go wrong, also giving a bit of space so that they can learn from the mistakes. I concur.
That's a great point, Eric. Actually, letting people learn from mistakes it's very difficult to do.
Yeah.
Sometimes you watch somebody heading towards a mistake that you can see it clearly, but there are two ways to get them to understand that they're making a mistake. And one is to come in and say, you're making a mistake. And whether or not they believe you, they're still going to do, of course, what you say because you're the boss, but they may not believe that they were on the wrong track. And the amount of value they'll get by trying it and then coming to understand it themselves can be so high. So in a low stakes scenario, you got to let people just stretch out. And by the way, I'm sure you've experienced this yourself. Sometimes you go let people make a mistake and it turns out, nope, they were actually right. And it was brilliant that you gave them the space to go do that and prove that to you. So
yeah, absolutely. Nobody knows everything in every context. Yeah, absolutely.
I was watching, I would just in that space, I was watching a talk that Kent Beck, the extreme programming guy, gave a few years back. And I remember him, I can't remember the details of it, but the idea was people ask him, where do you get these great ideas? And he says, I don't. All of my ideas start out as dumb ideas. If they were great ideas, people would have thought of them already. So I start with the ideas that are stupid because then I've got a better chance that nobody's already thought of it. And hey, if it's a stupid idea, but it works, then it turns into a great idea. So, letting people have room to become, a future Kent Beck themselves really is a huge opportunity for your team when you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So when did you get to executive? How did that feel? What changed for you in that context from leading your team?
It was it depends on where different people define executive at different levels. I had my first director role was leading engineering for an IoT platform business that was part of LogMeIn, called Zively. And, in there I was, arguably I thought I was a part of the executive team at the time. And so I was behaving in that way. And we were able to build and deliver something that was really groundbreaking, even though nobody wanted to buy it. It was a groundbreaking piece of tech. The what was changing for me there, and what changed in the following roles that I had that really were moving into the executive, was what I was accountable for changed quite a bit. The real difference is, are you the person who's making sure that the business objective is getting achieved? Or are you the person who's deciding what the business objective should be in the first place? And then figuring out how to achieve the objective, of course, with your team. And that's the transition, right? Where you're part of the group that's deciding this is what makes our business work, or this is what makes our company the best at X. And that's that real executive transition. So at Zively, I was a part of that. And then, moving into O'Reilly and Amazon, it became a much bigger part of my job to decide what do we need to accomplish in order to achieve our business goals. And the next part of that is, who are you interfacing with on a daily basis, changes quite a bit. If you're having frequent conversations with the CEO, then you're probably part of the exec loop in some way. So even if you don't have necessarily an executive title, when you're having those conversations, you should recognize you're now part of that loop, and the expectations that loop is going to have of you and your work product is going to change quite a bit as well.
Yeah. And so inside, what would you say, if any? I agree with you that this is a muddy space, because VP of engineering, head of engineering means so many different things, as does CTO. And how, in terms of your journey to C-suite, what was the difference, if you like, between, say, whatever, like VP of engineering, head of engineering, to being a CTO, where you have eventually a VP of engineering or head of engineering?
Yeah, that was, that the biggest shift there for me was, so I was at Wayfair. I was leading a very large department at Wayfair, building all of the technology that our suppliers used. And the folks who were reporting to me at any other company would have been a VP of engineering, right? They were at that company, they were directors, but a Wayfair director may be a VP outside of Wayfair at a smaller business. And working with that level of executive, a VP working for you, means that you've got to start clearing the decks for them to do the amazing work that they are now capable of doing, with both the increased scope, but also the responsibility you're putting on them. Somebody getting to that level in their careers has gotten there, hopefully, because of the talent that they've got. And if you don't harness it by allowing them to do the work that they know is the right thing and giving them that space, then you are not going to get the outcome you're looking for. I would say the biggest, sort of the official transition into a CTO type of role was when I left Wayfair and I went to Zipcar as the chief technology officer. And suddenly the weight of the responsibility changed quite a bit. When I was at Wayfair, the organization was large, and I had these folks who were operating at an executive level working for me, and I was very proud of what we were doing. But if there was something that happened, with Wayfair technology as a whole, well, it wouldn't have been me getting that phone call, right? I was still sort of the person who would help to answer, but not answer the question. Taking on the role at Zipcar meant that there was no other place for a problem to stop, sort of climbing the ladder up to. It became all my problem. And I remember that feeling of both having like, great, I now can finally take what I've learned, put it into practice, and see the outcomes that I've always dreamed I would be able to do with no friction. And simultaneously thinking, wow, every one of our clients, every customer of Zipcar, of which I was one, now depends on me and the decisions that I make so that they can get up in the morning, get into a car and go take care of their chores or errands or whatever for that day, or get up and go to the mountains and go hiking or whatever they wanted to use their Zipcar for. Suddenly that responsibility was overwhelming. And I definitely lost sleep as I realized things I didn't know. Like, oh, I don't know how that system works. I don't know how, there's a 20-year-old piece of technology we still depend on. And there's only 3 people in Boston who know the programming language that it's written in. That kind of thing was keeping me up. And it almost ate me alive, I would say, in my first couple of weeks as I was trying to come to terms with what that meant. And my approach to that was to look inside the business at who was already there and say, who here can I start talking to help me breathe and sleep better? Because I know, while it feels like it's all on me, I've got this whole community of engineers that are also feeling a lot of responsibility for making this thing work well. And that's when I started to integrate myself into that group as a part of the engineering team at Zipcar instead of an executive sort of floating above it. And man, I cannot say enough about how much better I started to feel as soon as people felt comfortable talking to me the same way they felt comfortable talking to each other. So that was a big, important lesson for me. And as we spun a new business out of that, we created FlexCar, we spun that out. And, I tried to stay as close to being part of the engineering fabric of the business as I could instead of being the, floaty, works up in a different space sort of CTO cliche.
Yeah, that integration is important. As you say, it is overwhelming when you first arrive because you really don't know anything unless you worked in the organization. And you need to figure out not only what are your strengths, but what are your weaknesses as a team.
That's right.
Yeah, I concur. Okay. So looking back at your career and where you are now, what do you see success as? And what has helped you be successful?
So the success is, my job here is to make it possible for my company to come up with an idea, turn it into a product, and get it into the hands of a customer who's going to tell me, this is great, here's some money, or this is terrible, thanks anyway, right? Like, to do that as frequently with as high quality of an output as possible, with a cost that makes sense for those kinds of experiments. So success to me is getting an idea from our product partner, from a smart engineering intern who came up with it during their tenure here, for somebody who's sitting in the support staff who's helping to support our clients, to get those ideas to turn into real products and capabilities in the hands of a user or a customer. Success is when it's in their hands. And that's it. We don't raise the mission accomplished flag until that happens. The way that you do that is by empowering your teams in a few different ways. There's really 4 things that I think make up a high performing team. And I'll mention the most important one last, but like, to me, it's the people that you've got. It's the process that they use to execute. It's the tools that they have access to. And the 4th one is the culture. And the reason why I left that one last is because it's the one I would want to talk about most. Culture is something that is going to either happen to you or you're going to define it for your team. And you've got to you really have to decide, what is the culture that we have at our company? For me, wherever I go, that culture has got to be a culture of shipping. We got to be a culture where shipping software is what we're here to do. Sure, it's fun to experiment with new tech. Sure, it's fun to try out different things that we, as engineers, get to experiment and play with. But ultimately, we only celebrate when we ship. That's the cultural aspect of it. And shipping can look like a lot of things. For a software engineer, that can look like my code got deployed to production. For a person in marketing, that can be my campaign is out there and running and we're getting feedback. Shipping can mean a lot of things in your business, but culturally, your business has to celebrate shipping as the winning thing. The people thing is the other most important part, and that's why I mentioned that one first. Having people who embrace that culture and spread it and literally live it is how you're going to make sure that you win. Like if you have poor process and tools, you're still going to struggle with friction. But if you've got that culture and you've got the right mix of people who understand what your business is trying to do, it doesn't matter if you've got a team that's made entirely out of interns or a team that's made out of principal engineers that all came from Google and Amazon. If they get what you're trying to do and they're bought in and they're able to do that, you're gonna have success. And then you reduce the friction for those great people by giving them the ability to define the right process for achieving their goal. And that means getting out of their way and not over specifying your mechanisms for getting work done. And you give them the best tools. Like don't saddle your team with a source code management tool that's straight out of the late 90s. Like make sure that they've got access to whatever it is that reduces the friction for them to do their job. Now, this one is actually a tricky one, I think, because if you ask an engineer, what do you need to do your job the best? The answer may not be what you think. In the same way where you ask your customer the question like, oh, tell me what you need, and they're going to tell you something, and then you have to listen for what's underneath that. You got to do the same thing with your engineering team. Like they might say like, oh, well, what I need is to build an entire like framework out of micro front ends. And then if I do that, then all of a sudden I get all of these things. It's like, well, do we need micro front ends? Do we need all of that? Or is what we need, some way to make the problem that micro front end solves a solved problem so we don't have to think about it, right? So we don't have to come up with a solution. So look for those opportunities as you're defining the tools part, like to find the hidden need instead of the specific direct ask. But that's it.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And like, what else would you say has helped you be successful?
Mentors, without a doubt, find a person, and they don't necessarily have to be a person who's done your job, but a person who's going to give you feedback that you can trust is really important. Somebody who's going to question your assumptions and help you to question them. Find somebody like that in your life. Like I said, I'm lucky to have two amazing mentors who I still frequently reach out to when I need things, just when I'm trying to make sense of an idea. So that's how you're going to find success. And the other thing is, don't get too hung up on anything that you've been successful at so far, because that only lasts for so long. You shipped something great, everyone loves it, wonderful. That is going to wear off. So what are you going to ship next? Don't take your eyes off of that next thing that you're trying to get done and keep moving towards it.
Thanks, Freedom. So what is a problem that you are looking at and trying to figure out at the moment?
We're trying to find, it's really important for us to acknowledge that we are living in a world that will be radically transformed by the presence of AI, especially large language models, right? We've already seen some big transformation, and it seems like, every other day there's some new revolutionary LLM-based product out there that's changing the way that we work. And it's important for us to, number one, don't just immediately assume it solves problems that it claims to solve, because for any of us who have used some of the fantastic AI coding assistants, we know while they are very impressive, they certainly don't solve the problem the way that you think. In fact, that's one of the things that we've learned it doesn't do. It doesn't replace a software engineer, right? You still need a human who understands the problem you're trying to solve and who can understand whether or not the code that's been generated actually solves that problem in most cases. But what we've got to figure out is, how do we make these tools a part of our daily life so that engineers have access to them seamlessly? They can empower the engineers without getting in their way, and they can reduce the friction that they've got when working with peers. Right now, we've been running Cursor internally, and so folks have picked that up, but not everyone is. And so how does a person who's using Cursor work with an engineer who's not? And what does that look like? And who's to blame when Cursor generates a whole lot of code that some other engineer objects to? Things like this we're coming up against. And the other thing we've got to figure out is it's really becoming on us as the engineering group to start educating the rest of the business on how these kinds of technologies can become a part of the products that we build and offer. There's a lot of imagination that's happening. Our product team is certainly capable of imagining a lot of those things, but getting some experience with working with and building with and utilizing these tools is something that we've got to embark on from the engineering perspective so that we can help our product teams imagine real outcomes instead of just pure fantasy. Or in some cases, I'll tell you, Eric, I've seen people way under imagining what's possible. Right? I can't. I'm sure you're seeing this, and everyone listening to this. Every new AI product that is getting announced seems to just be, it's our same product, but now we've got a chat bot added on to it. And boy, howdy, that is not that impressive right now because quite frankly, I can do that myself by just opening up a chat GPT window next to your product, and it'll probably get me the same outcome in most cases, minus whatever RAG or fine tuning you've done. So we've got to help our product teams in this way. And that's something that we're trying to figure out. How do we do that effectively so that our product teams can imagine amazing new capabilities for our customers that we can actually deliver on?
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And so I guess like a couple of things I want to just check in with is like when you think about working with the exec that you're fully in, or even working with the board, are there kind of like bits of wisdom that you've accrued from your time in working in those two spaces that we haven't mentioned already?
Yeah, when you get to the point in your career where you're working with the board, you are working with people who have similar but very different motivation than the executives that are part of your company. So it's really important early on as you get introduced to the board to understand their motivations, what the board is envisioning as the future of the company. And it doesn't always happen that whoever is the CEO of the company and the board of the company has that same vision for the company. And you've got to understand whether or not that is or isn't the case. If the board and the CEO don't share the same vision, you need to talk with the CEO about what does that mean and how does your CEO want you to engage with the board in such a way that you're not derailing their plans. At the same time, you want to recognize that the board's role is to ensure that the company is on a track for some greater success. And so whatever their motivation may be, even if it's different, you've got to pay attention to that motivation and speak to it when you talk to them. So when you prepare your board presentation, talk to those folks who are already familiar with your board or who have spent some time with them and say, what do you think? And then talk about the chairman. Say, what do you think the chairman is going to think about this topic? Or what has the chairman said in the past about this topic? Look for that. Read everything you can about previous board meetings that have happened so you can kind of get a understanding of topics that have come up before. And then be prepared for some real candor. A board of directors that's operating effectively is going to be extremely candid with you in a way that may feel uncomfortable if you haven't experienced that before. They're going to say things that feel like an insult, but really it's a pragmatic or practical point of view from their position, what they see in the business or the opportunity landscape. Don't get offended. Don't feel like you're being attacked. They want the same thing you want, and ultimately that's some sort of success. They just may be looking at success a little bit differently.
Thank you. What are you seeing in the wider tech market at the moment, Freedom?
I think we're seeing a bit of a rebound in terms of engineers finding new opportunities. We definitely went through some dark times where engineering resources were, we were just seeing lots of layoffs all across the board. I won't try to sugarcoat that. And it was a real painful time. Companies that I were at were not immune to this, sadly, and probably one of the most challenging things that I've ever had to do as a leader is, execute a layoff. It was not something I enjoyed doing. And I would say probably lost more sleep during that than any other point of time in my career. Now what I'm seeing is opportunities opening up. It's not like it was before, but we're seeing people getting optimistic about building new things. We're seeing people getting optimistic about what AI means for our ability to create a new product that hasn't existed before. And that's encouraging companies to make some new investments. And I'm seeing more and more people starting to get work. I'm seeing a resurgence in something we didn't cover is that I brought Ruby on Rails back into my life sort of in the latter part of my career, and I've been thrilled with that. And what I'm seeing as I do that is that technologies that were sort of feeling like people weren't making big investments in are having a renaissance. So Ruby and Rails is having a huge renaissance at the moment. Laravel is making sure that PHP is having a huge renaissance at the moment as well. So we're seeing these technologies which were originally built for making engineers extremely productive, but sort of fell by the wayside as we had ever larger engineering teams and ever expanding budgets. These technologies are coming back because, if I don't have the large engineering team, I can be very effective if I use these technologies with a smaller team. So we're seeing that come back, and which does mean jobs for people who have those skills are starting to come back. And we're seeing new kinds of jobs. I think that's the other thing. We're seeing completely new kinds of jobs that are poorly defined, which are really about building software using AI tools. And what does that mean? Is that a product job? Is that an engineer's job? Is that a designer's job? Is it some homogenization of those jobs? So that's what I'm seeing today.
Yeah, awesome. I also had a recent, I would say, resurgence of Ruby on Rails in my life when like Rails 8 PWA, progressive web apps, is becoming more of a standard. And also then thinking about how do you get infrastructure out of your way to build a small business. And now I've worked in many stacks. Like I definitely see that particularly building a business, Ruby and Rails moves faster often than say like TypeScript, Node kind of perspective. But it's interesting like that we're getting to that next level of like, okay, what more can we do? And it's good to see the resurgence both in Ruby and Rails and PHP. Okay. What do you do for fun, Freedom?
It's a great question. So besides, I love going out to see live music and just enjoying shows and things like that. But most often, if I'm not, sitting at a laptop or writing code, you will find me in my garage making something out of wood, really making a lot of sawdust, and hopefully in the end there's a interesting thing that I've made. Usually it's some sort of, I really got into this woodworking thing because I wanted to make a board game that didn't exist in the market. This like ancient, I don't know if any listeners have heard of a board game that I'm going to mispronounce probably, Hanefatoffel or something. I think that's how you pronounce it. So it's a very ancient asymmetric game akin to chess, where players play as either a king with his army trying to escape or an army trying to capture the king. And it's a beautiful, fun game. And you can buy a set, but if you really want a really nice set, you're probably going to have to make it yourself. So started at woodworking just so I could make myself a nice set and play that game with pieces that I was really excited about. And since then, I've moved on to making furniture and all kinds of other stuff. So that's where I'm spending my free time.
It is amazing to use your hands on a more regular basis than to type. I find it activates parts of the brain and joy in a way that are very powerful.
That's right. There's an old saying, and I don't know where it originates from, but somebody shared it with me, and I thought so apt. A person who works with their mind must rest with their hands. And I could not agree with that more, because I do find I am the most relaxed when I'm in the garage, even when I've, frustratingly mismeasured something, or, my box is not coming out square or something like that. It still feels like I'm a million miles away from anything that resembles, work when I'm doing that.
Awesome. At some point, we should talk offline about games. I have about 400 board games. And wonderful. I love games because it's a great way to learn strategies without all the pain. Well, sometimes pain of your friends losing and you losing, of course, but that's good pain.
It's a great way for teams to build affinity as well. Like so one of the things we didn't talk about this much, but practically every company that I've been a part of, we've made, a board game night some regular part of what we do, getting, similarly interested folks and sometimes recruiting people who never played a board game together to play games. There's a certain kind of affinity and camaraderie that can be built around a game table that's hard to do in any other way. And I highly believe in the effectiveness of tabletop games for that.
Yeah, there's a quote from Aristotle. Not sure if it's true. I should evidence this, but the quote is, you'll learn more in playing a board game with someone than a year of conversation.
So
and
true.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. But anyways.
Although anyone who plays a game with me where I maybe take an advantage that feels a little unfair, I don't do that in my normal life. It's just, I just really want to win the game. So my apologies to all of my board game opponents. By the way, I frequently lose at board games also. I'm not really the best, but still enjoy them.
Freedom, thank you very much for coming on to the show and sharing your wisdom and what you've learned in your journey. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. It was a lot of fun talking. And yes, I will take you up on catching up later about board games.
Okay.